everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Correa, and today I'm going to talk to you about an English learner development course that was designed to be asset and research based. And I studied if participation in this course increased the likelihood that English learners would reach their state's reclassification benchmark. And a bit of background on this study is that I use the term English learners because this study deals with identification and reclassification. And within this state, English learner is that status of identified, reclassified, where I do use the term multilingual learners to discuss our multilingual learners as human beings rather than identification points. Multilingual learners have language assets and funds of knowledge that we should embed within our English medium programs, and we will talk about that later in this presentation. But I just wanted to clarify the terminology as why I used English learners for this particular study. So all English learners have the right to access language programs. Now, these language programs are designed for really two things. One, access content area curriculum, and two, develop English. And develop English is what the federal government means by overcoming language barriers. And the barrier is developing English language proficiency. And the federal government also says within a reasonable amount of time. So unpacking some of those terms, as I already said, overcoming barriers is when an English learner is able to reach that state's reclassification benchmark, which happens once a year on the English language proficiency assessment. And a reasonable amount of time for this study was that the student has met reclassification before becoming a long-term English learner. So a long-term English learner, in the context I'm using, is that the child or the student has been in school, U.S. school systems for 5 years. After that 5th year, the year 6, they would then become a long-term English learner. And so we know, according to research on language development, the typical time to develop academic language proficiency is about 5 to 7 years. But so many factors impact that development of language proficiency. And so reasonable amount of time in this study is prior to becoming a long-term English learner. And so we have some problems in the United States regarding our language programming, particularly English medium programming for English learners. What we know is that by and large, our English medium programs can have some significant flaws. We know that bilingual programs are best. However, in the context that I've predominantly worked in at the high school setting, bilingual programs are very hard to implement due to many logistical complications, whether it be staffing, different content areas, graduation requirements. Many variables impact the complexity of bilingual programs at the high school level. So the majority use English medium programs. And also, we need to remember that most of our research about implementing a research-based program is that much of the research is done at the elementary level. And actually, I do want to go back to the previous slide for a minute to talk about those language program models, which are required to be research-based, based on sound educational theory. They must be implementing according to that theory with sufficient resources, which means qualified staff and personnel. And most importantly, is that they're evaluated for effectiveness on an annual basis. And so this study is really amplifying that evaluation for effectiveness. Is the program supporting students overcome language barriers in a reasonable amount of time? And so while we know our program has some deficits, we must overcome those deficits in making sure that we create the best English medium programs for our students. But we also know that the English language proficiency assessment is a gatekeeper for reclassification and growth, certainly, but reclassification is a focus of this study. So our English language proficiency assessments have to measure speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But all assessments come with flaws. And this assessment is administered once a year, And it very much relies on academic language, academic knowledge across the content areas, and a normed expectation that English learners have awareness of US cultural norms. And what I mean by that is that it's scored in a certain way that it has expectations of language outcomes. And there's no way an English language assessment can truly capture proficiency in all shapes and forms. And so it's a singular measurement, but it is that gatekeeper for reclassification. And we know that there's absolute cultural biases and mismatches for our full English learner population at large, because our English learners and multilingual learners in the United States are a culturally, linguistically, socioeconomically diverse group. They are not a monolithic group. And so having cultural matches is incredibly complex for an assessment to do. And so I do want to emphasize why it's important to study reclassification at all. So when an English learner does reach that reclassification benchmark, it does become a predictor of future academic success, leading to fewer achievement gaps, and it increases access to college preparation materials, AP courses, and has a significant impact on graduating high school and participating in post-secondary education. We know the significant impacts that has on someone financially over the long term. And so we do want to make sure that our programs provide the best opportunities for English learners to be successful post our pre-K through 12 experiences. And narrowing in on the population of long-term English learners, remember that reasonable amount of time. Long-term English learners are our fastest growing and most vulnerable population of English learners. And so when we have language programs that are not helping English learners overcome those barriers, we know our program model needs revamping. It is not effectively doing what it's supposed to do. Because after 5 years, we would hope that our English learners have developed enough English language proficiency, academic language to be successful on that assessment. And so you can see some of those, the reasons here listed under number 2 of why long-term English learners are a subgroup of ELLs that need focus and need support. And so now what? We know that there's a problem with language programming. To solve that, we need to make sure that we're implementing research and asset-based programming for students, particularly in the high school levels, making sure they're making progress towards graduation, having opportunities for post-secondary success. And as required by law, we need to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And it is required by law, and that's a compliance issue, but more so, it is a movement for social justice. We need to make sure that our programs support English learners in demonstrating growth or reaching reclassification, because it allows so many more opportunities for success later on. And so when we evaluate our programs, we understand what we're doing well, what gaps we have, and what supports our students need. And local level program evaluation is absolutely critical, because it's impossible, not impossible, but it's very difficult to evaluate the success of program models across states, or even sometimes within your own state. One, across states, it's difficult because every state has the autonomy to choose which language proficiency assessment they're going to use, and the state chooses that reclassification benchmark. So it's a moving target from one state to another. And then locally, that what you call a program model, say for example, English language development, how it's implemented varies greatly from school to school. So that local level evaluation is critically important. And so a broad sweep of the research was focusing on the language and culture and cultural capital needed to do well on English language proficiency assessments. Academic language is what is assessed in the English proficiency assessment, and it's a very complex and contextualized language. So it is very much embedded within the content areas. And so that language looks different across, for example, explaining a science experiment versus explaining the cause and effect in a social studies classroom versus explaining how a character evolves in an ELA classroom. So different types of language uses and purposes vary based on context. And so there's this spectrum where we talk about explicit teaching versus acquisition and natural use of language. And so it's important to remember that there is this spectrum, and essentially both are important: explicit instruction and natural spaces. It's also important to know that language and culture are intertwined. And so how someone communicates is very much dependent on that person's culture. And we know that cultural norms and cultural capital are assessed on the English language proficiency assessment. And so how people do on that assessment absolutely is grounded in their knowledge of, and I'm using air quotations, the game, the knowledge of the assessment. What are the assessment, what is the test looking for as far as those test creators and the test rubric generators? What do they want me to do to be successful? And so in this response to the problem of subpar programs at the high school level, I, along with other educators, wanted to really explore if we truly use language acquisition theory and research, can we design a strong English language development class, which we call academic literacy? Can we develop a strong one that enhances our English medium program at the high school level? And so through a really broad and deep research of language acquisition theory, social justice, assessment bias, how culture impacts performance, we as a group, there were 5 of us, developed these guiding principles in designing the academic literacy curriculum. And so here are all 6. You're more than welcome to hit pause on this, but through the next slides, I'll talk about each in turn. And then those principles really were connected to research-based practices and framed the full curriculum development of this ELD course. And so the first principle was about explicit instruction in academic language across all language domains: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And so we wanted to make sure that all domains were embedded, but also making sure that we considered cultural norms and expectations within those language domains. And here's one example as far as listening, right? We might think about, okay, when you're listening to someone, what kind of language uses did that speaker use to establish themselves as a credible speaker? And then what we might do is talk about how that might vary based on your cultural background. And then we use real life examples of, for example, eyewitness accounts in news programs. And so we use language, culture, and real life application. We also pulled from 2 great sources. One was the Academic A-List by Burke and Gilmore, and these are the high frequency academic terms, and we use them and how they were used across content areas. And we also use SERP's word generation to think about academic language across content areas. Then we thought about multilingual learners, and what we know is that students who are bilingual and multilingual can use their native languages to better acquire and develop English. And so we wanted to make sure we embedded cognate instruction. We wanted to make sure we leveraged our students' funds of knowledge and encouraged native language use within the English medium program. Another was about not only building their U.S. cultural norms, but validating and discussing students' home culture, what compares, what contrasts, and making sure we filled in some background knowledge gaps, if there were any, that were commonly assessed in the language proficiency assessments. So for example, we were seeing themes of American literature being brought out, like transcendentalism. And so we were thinking of types of background knowledge that students would need to be successful. and selecting those materials purposely to make sure we addressed them within the course. And having those conversations of what transfers and what doesn't from someone's home culture to the US. Another really critical component of this academic literacy course was we provided flexibility and autonomy. So we know that these both encourage students and faculty with teaching ELD courses. So one is we believed in our content area and English learner educators to design this curriculum. It wasn't from a package or a company that we built, we purchased. It was very much grade level expertise in that they were all teaching grade level content areas. And so we knew that we needed to fold this in to this academic literacy course. And so we developed the curriculum where we had suggested topics and materials where teachers had the autonomy to select from this menu of options so they could diversify it for their students each year. And another really important note is that we did not want to require this course for students. And so you might be thinking, well, of course, the numbers will look great for those who elected to participate. But actually what we did was we used it as an elective for those who wanted to increase their skills. But we also used it as credit recovery. So many of our English learners were entering our schools later in their high school experience and were credit deficient. And so they needed to recover credit to be on the path to graduation. So it was used for two purposes, elective or for credit recovery. But because we didn't require participation, it did open up that autonomy to increase engagement for our students. Another principle was making sure we set high expectations. And this is really important to consider that we did not water down our content and that we absolutely provided scaffolding and support, but we did cognitively challenging concepts within the course that challenged their thinking. So one example is a unit was on ethical decision making, and one was, should juveniles be incarcerated? And here we talked about personal narratives, we talked about law, we talked about whose responsibility is it to make good decisions, ethical decision making. And it was not, we really elevated them as high school students to have these difficult conversations, but we made sure that the materials were accessible based on language proficiency levels, but it was really engaging that they felt that they had voice within this course. And then our sixth principle was making sure that the teachers of this course really explicitly, but also implicitly, talked about the English language proficiency assessment and other assessments, such as the SATs, and how those assessments are barriers for marginalized students, and that we were going to overcome those barriers together. And so it supported the building of agency for students in that we were not like teaching to the test to you need to do this to do well. It was how can we overcome the barriers or the burdens and play the rules of the game to demonstrate how much we know. And so it really did motivate students when they felt that they had more control over you are being tested to you control the outcome of your performance. We can overcome this. And so that was a really important mind shift for students and teachers. So with these principles in mind, how did we develop the curriculum? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there were 5 of us who did this work. 3 were duly certified in English and TESOL. 1 was secondary social studies and TESOL, and then 1 did not have a TESOL certification, but was duly certified in English and social studies. So it was really important that we had grade level experts and also the TESOL knowledge. And we were able to align the curriculum of this ELD course, academic literacy, to grade level standards and the English language proficiency standards in our state. And because we designed it as a half of an English and a half of a social studies credit, we wanted to make sure we embedded both content areas and different types of texts in those content areas. And also know that academic literacy was added to a sheltered instruction program that already existed in the high school setting. So sheltered instruction was a predominant language model, added academic literacy, this designated ELD model, and also we had a newcomer program and we had heritage speakers program. So we had quite a few models operating in tandem. So this study really wanted to examine, after we did all of this work to create this amazing academic literacy ELD class, did participation in the course have an impact on the English learner's likelihood to reach reclassification on that annual assessment, the annual English language proficiency assessment? So we had 3 questions, which is basically, was the likelihood higher for those who participated than those who did not participate? And again, prior to high school graduation. Then we wondered about adjusting for factors. We knew that people would be critical of, if it was an elective course, how do we adjust for those factors that might make it look like this is a special population that's going to achieve higher than others? So we wanted to adjust for those factors that impact their success. And so we did gender, time and country, and free and reduced lunch status. And then we really wanted to explore the long-term English learner status. Were our long-term English learners who participated more likely to reach reclassification than the long-term English learners who did not participate? And so if you take a look at our research site, it was a very large high school and a very diverse student body. This high school has about 2,300 students annually, with very diverse linguistic, cultural, socioeconomic backgrounds. And so in this sample, we looked at 5 years of testing data from 2015 to 2019. And in that study, we had 418 English learners. And of those English learners, they had several different countries of origin and native languages. And so this table on the right just really summarizes the participation of students in academic literacy or not in academic literacy. And I wanted to just bring out this point of GPA. So if you look at the students who participated, the English learners who participated in academic literacy compared to those who don't, their GPA is really 0.3 apart. And so they really were a very similar student group. And there are slight variations, slightly more females than males participated, and slightly fewer students who were free and reduced lunch status participated. So there were a few variables here, and time and country, you can go through and see how they were categorized. Now this 6+ years category is how we measured our long-term English learners. And so the measurement within this state is the Lost Links assessment. So Lost Links is a ELP assessment where it measures the 4 domains of reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And in this state, reclassification meant an English learner got a 4 or 5 on these 3 areas: reading, writing, and overall. And so to analyze the data for research question 1, 2, and 3, we used binomial logistic regression, essentially asking reclassification, yes or no. And certainly we then controlled for those factors that we have already discussed. And what we found at the first level is that academic literacy English learners were, on average, 1.6 times more likely to reach reclassification than those who did not participate. And that likelihood was marginally significant. What we found is when we added those student variables, gender, time and country, and lunch status, the measurement became a much better fit, and so that's what we used here for the assessment. So it gave us a much better picture of how academic literacy did impact reclassification. Now, for our long-term English learners, we found that really there was not much of a difference, only an increase of 0.3 percentage points as far as those participating reaching reclassification. But the wide and overlapping confidence intervals did not really tell us much. And so what we think is that we just did not have a big enough sample size to really determine academic literacy's impact on reclassification. But what we did find was interesting and that we were not looking at when we first started was the group that had the most impact on reclassification were those students who were in the United States schools for 4 to 5 years. So before they hit long-term English learner status. And for this group of people, the students who participated in academic literacy, the reclassification rates were 31.6% on average, and that compares to 15.2%. So that's a pretty significant difference of 16.4 percentage points. So what we found was that the students who participated in the academic literacy class actually had reached reclassification before becoming long-term English learners. And so, again, our purpose was to build the best English language program model for our English learners as we could. And we really wanted to make sure we leveraged research and asset-based practices to support our students in overcoming the barriers of the assessment. And obviously that includes developing their U.S. cultural knowledge and developing their academic English proficiency. And we found that it worked. So this is a repeat of those other slides, but it really did make an impact for students to participate in this academic literacy course. So this was a great look at local program evaluation, especially when in later years, administration was hoping to cut a class because of staffing. We used this study to make sure it was retained because it supported student outcome measures. And so that was a really valuable practice for this high school. And so we do believe that this sheds light on the potential benefits of combining sheltered instruction and English language development in a high school setting. And it also supported additional literature about English medium program models at the high school. But we do say this with some caution, which is that the findings are specific to this high school. It is not common that teachers are given the autonomy to create their own curriculum. So we took that very seriously, and guess what? It worked. But also we only included 3 different student level variables, so we should expand that in the future. And also, this is focusing only on those outcome measures of reclassification. We did not do any observations of the class in action, so we did not see if those principles in practice were actually being done in the classroom. We should expand that sample size for long-term English learners, but at this high school, what was exciting was that the course was actually preventing long-term English learner status. So it was a good thing to not have that big of sample size as the years went on. But we would love to do some more research at this site, especially looking at the class in action. Really, what kind of principles and practices were we seeing? And we hope this study could support other local level leaders, inspiring some solid program evaluations. And so thank you so much for listening to this presentation today. I do hope that you stop by for questions and conversations about academic literacy and how this ELD course did support students with reaching reclassification benchmarks.